Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversations, the Economic Crisis.
Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation series on the financial crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc from the United Nations University Office at the UN here in New York, and welcome to the show. With us today, we have Mr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN-DESA. And Jomo is also on the Commission of Experts of the President of the UN General Assembly on reforms of the international monetary and financial system. It's a huge enterprise, and Jomo is here with us today to discuss mainly the coordination of global responses to the financial and economic crisis. So Jomo, thank you for being here today. And let's perhaps begin with simple questions. There has been a lot of talk about the need and importance of a coordinated global response to the financial crisis. And you know, in this connection, I have three simple questions as a way to start our conversation. First of all, why is global coordination necessary? Second of all, it seems to me that in fact, although we talk a lot about this, nothing much is happening in this area. In connection with this, do you think that the upcoming UN conference on the matter will be, let's say, a game changer in the area? So first of all, why is it so important to have a coordinated response when it comes to this financial and economic crisis?
Thank you, Jean-Marc. That's a very long question, but let me begin with the first part.
Yes.
There are many reasons, of course, why coordination is important, but let me reduce it to two main reasons. Okay. One of the big problems we had before the Second World War was a lack of coordination. Mm-hmm. And in 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, there was the United Nations Conference on Monetary and Financial Affairs, which is better known as the Bretton Woods Conference, which after almost a month of meeting created the basic framework for the international monetary and financial system after the war. That system lasted until 1971, and basically it has collapsed. It collapsed since then. The very famous, the leading international monetary economist of the post-war period, Robert Triffin, described what happened subsequently as a non-system, and this is something which is shared by many people who have worked in this area. We do not have a system, and in the absence of a system, the need for coordination is all the more urgent. Mm-hmm. What we also have right now is very clear evidence that coordination can make a difference and will benefit all parties.
What is this evidence?
The evidence is offered in the World Economic Situation and Prospects 2009 update, which we launched last week, where the last part of that update discusses scenarios of coordination and non-coordination. Of course, there are various assumptions in both scenarios, and what the update clearly demonstrates is that a coordinated scenario will benefit all parties, mm-hmm. Developed countries, developing countries, transition economies, and most of all, the least developed countries.
So basically, the short answer to your answer is, you know, it's a win-win situation for everybody. So why is it, if it is the case, that in fact, beyond talks, nothing much seems to be happening? Or is it an unfair assessment of the situation?
I think it would be slightly unfair to say that. Mm-hmm. It is true that coordination leaves a lot to be desired, But certainly there has been a will, there has been some desire to try to bring about some coordination. There was, of course, in October last year, around the annual World Bank IMF meetings, some effort to bring about coordination through the G7 and at the European level shortly after that in October 2008. This basically, both these efforts did not achieve very much. There was some success at the European level, but not very much through the G7. President Sarkozy saw this problem. He came to see Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and subsequently went to see President Bush. And then, as we know, in the middle of November 2008, there was a meeting hosted in Washington what was called the G20. The G20 meeting was actually the first time the G20 ever met at the leaders level, although the G20 had already existed for a decade. But the level of coordination which was achieved at that time was simply a declaration of intent not to undertake protectionism and so on.
So why is it so difficult to achieve a meaningful coordination while it seems that everybody thinks that it would be a good thing for everybody? So where is the challenge? Where is the difficulty?
The greatest difficulty, of course, is that there has been the absence of coordination ever since the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. When President Nixon declared the end of the Bretton Woods system in September 1971, he basically declared the end of a system of coordination.
And if you could give us a bit of an assessment of what have been the effects of this lack of coordination in the past 35 years or so. I mean, what has been the price that we have paid for this lack of coordination, which you say we should now somehow overcome?
Well, I think the most important consequence of this is arguably what might be considered a poorer growth performance, greater volatility, greater instability, slower progress in terms of economic welfare of the inhabitants of this globe, and a number of other problems as well. I think all this is a terrible indictment. If we think of the immediate post-war period up to the early 1970s, this period is often referred to as the post-war golden age, a period of very rapid reconstruction after the destruction of the Second World War, a period of growth and development in many of the developing countries. Unfortunately, this came to an end in the 70s.
So in essence, you are saying that somehow good coordination has an impact on our ability to conceive and implement good policies, right? We're going to go back to the issue in a minute. First of all, before we move on, so this conference is going to take place in a few weeks towards the end of June. What do you expect from this conference? Because I understand that UNDESA, in fact, is preparing some of the documents which are going to be discussed in the context of this conference. So what are your expectations, and do you feel that it's going to be a landmark conference? I mean, I certainly think that you hope that it's going to be a landmark conference, but what are your expectations?
Well, at this point, a lot of things are up in the air. It's like the juggler with so many balls in the air, and it's very difficult to see how successful this whole process can be. Much will depend on the negotiations over the remaining 3 weeks or so before the conference, and the ability of the negotiators to persuade the leaders at the global level to attend this conference in strength. My understanding is that, for instance, the larger developing countries and transition economies in the G20, the so-called BRICS economies, are now reconsidering their position, and they may well attend in full force. At a fairly high level, from Russia, from Brazil, from South Africa, and so on and so forth.
Because initially it was not their intention to attend, and why was it so?
Well, it's very difficult for me to read the minds of, but as you know, there have been elections in both India and South Africa recently. In the case of Russia, I think, and China, there is a continued reassessment of the international economic situation and the political situation as well, because there is a lot at stake. And I think for many of the other developing countries, there's a sense of frustration about the inability to make progress, particularly in the Bretton Woods institutions, on questions of international economic governance. So there is a felt sense that the system is stacked against their interests. and that very little can be achieved in Washington, and therefore perhaps New York offers an opportunity to move the process forward by changing the game, as you said.
Precisely. I mean, you know, what is the role of your department of UNDESA in when it comes to the preparation of this conference? I mean, and perhaps more importantly, what is the take of your department on what should happen as a way to try to tackle the problems associated with this crisis?
Well, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or UNDESA, has responsibility over a wide range of economic, social and environmental issues which come before the United Nations. And we serve the member states through the Secretary General, and insofar as the member states decided to have this conference, they made this decision in early December last year, and they had a number of resolutions a few months ago, which basically clearly specified what they are expecting from this conference, and they have requested us to serve them by preparing background documents, and we have tried to do so to the best of our ability.
And precisely, what is the policy line that you are pushing forward, that you are promoting in terms of not simply coordination, but in terms of what could be done to really mitigate the negative effects of the crisis and perhaps go forward in a more positive manner?
I think clearly there is a strong shared sense in the world today that business cannot go on as usual. But of course there is no clear consensus on what exactly the alternative should be. So our role has been to try to identify why the existing system has been problematic, and try to indicate some of the directions, but it is not for us to decide for member states what the future should be. Yes.
What is your assessment of what happened precisely, since part of the background document that you're preparing for this conference had to do with establishing a post-mortem analysis of what happened? What are, in your view, or in the view of your department, the main causes behind this crisis?
Well, insofar as we are not dead, I would not like to call it a post-mortem.
Oh, okay. Well, we're close to it.
Yeah. What we try to do is to try to offer an objective analysis. As you know, there are many debates. Across the Atlantic, for instance, there's an important debate. The debate between the Anglo-American world and the continental European debate is another debate. A debate between North and South is another debate. And there are many other debates as well. So it is our task, our challenge to try to produce a balanced document which tries to lay bare what we believe to be the underlying forces at work. We have a reasonably good track record.
Yes.
Among all the international organizations, we were the only ones besides the Bank of International Settlements to warn of the likelihood of the crisis which we are unfortunately in. We take no satisfaction from the fact that we correctly warned about this, but we have to continue to try to remain ahead of the curve. And this is extremely difficult because, you know, it's very we are not in the business of astrology or forecasting. Is a is more of an art than a science in many ways, and so it is a very difficult task. But we are trying to demonstrate the implications of alternatives, of the alternative of not cooperating as opposed to cooperating, the alternative of having a stimulus in some parts of the world but not in other parts, as opposed to having a more balanced type of stimulus, and so on.
Before we go back to the issue of coordination, just one question as a way for me to have a better understanding of what is your view on the causes. So if you had to give a list of 2 or 3 reasons, deep reasons behind the collapse, so what would be these deep reasons?
Well, I would say that the 3 reasons would be: we have a system of reserves management since the end of Bretton Woods, which is not viable, where we have basically one or perhaps more than one, but just a small handful of currencies which are basically serving as the reserve currencies for the world. This allows the issuer of those currencies to run a massive deficit, and as a result of that we have had unsustainable global imbalances, which is part of the problem. And this has been looming very large over the last decade, and especially over the last 5 years.
So that would be the first reason?
Yeah, this is certainly the first reason. The second reason, I think, would be what would be called financial fragility, arising from what I suggested is a non-system which has developed in many different ways over the last 4 decades since the end of Bretton Woods. This non-system is poorly coordinated, and that's why to call it an international financial architecture is really an insult to architects.
Just a sub-question reacting to your argument. I mean, is there a link between this non-system and the willingness of this non-system to create systemic risks? You know, we always talk about the banks. So is there a link between what you describe as a non-system and the fact that we ended up creating banks which present a systemic risk for the non-system? Is there a link between the two?
Well, you're dealing with one specific question, which is part of the problem. And the part of the problem was that for the last 20 or 30 years, we had a very strong ideology of deregulation, favoring deregulation, and the alternative sometimes was so-called self-regulation, which didn't work. Okay, so you had parts of the system which were not regulated or very poorly regulated. You have other parts of the system which were regulated but inappropriately regulated.
So in a way, I'm just trying to understand, since I'm not a specialist, in a way part of your description of what a non-system is lack of regulation or inappropriate regulation.
And uneven regulation.
And uneven regulation.
Yes.
So that's the second reason. The third one, the third deep reason accounting for the fact that we are where we are today?
Yes, I think what we have seen, particularly over the last 3 or 4 decades, has been the ascendance of finance. Now, economists have always seen the world as one where finance is a very important, almost an essential handmaiden for the economy, for the functioning of the real economy. But what we have seen over the last 3 or 4 decades is the ascendance of finance and what some people call the financialization of the economy. I don't like the term, but it sounds almost French, so maybe you prefer it. But the consequence of the financialization of the economy is that we are no longer thinking about economic indicators, about economic objectives, but rather we are looking at financial indicators. And so that subordination of the real economy to finance is a fundamental part of the problem. And so we really need to regulate, not only regulate the financial system on its own terms, but need to rethink the regulation of the international economic system and the relationship of finance to the rest of the economy.
Okay, so that would be the third reason. Just to go back to the issue of coordination and policy. 2 questions. First of all, who is leading the charge, if you will, within the UN system when it comes to coordination? Is UNDESA, is the UN Secretariat really a key actor, or do we also have other actors within the UN family, or even the Bretton Woods institutions? I mean, who is leading the charge? Second question, alluding to what you mentioned earlier, tell us a bit more about the connection between good policies and good coordination.
Who is leading the charge?
Yes.
That is a difficult question to answer. And the question of the UN system in relation to that is also a difficult question to answer for 2 reasons. The UN system includes the Bretton Woods institutions. The relationship between the Bretton Woods institutions and the rest of the UN system has changed over time. As I mentioned earlier, in 1944, when Bretton Woods was created, although the United Nations organization did not exist at that point, it was seen, the creation of the Bretton Woods organization was seen as a part of post-war international governance, of a system of post-war multilateral governance which would create the conditions for peace, growth, development, prosperity, etc., etc. This was the view of those who were thinking about the post-war world at that time. Now, the Bretton Woods institutions have had governance arrangements which are very different from what we find in New York. Okay, and this is part of the problem. So,
how is it part of the problem?
Well, in Washington, basically, in the Bretton Woods institutions, to put it crudely, it's $1, 1 vote. Here it's 1 country, 1 vote. Now, one thinks that a 1 country, 1 vote approximates some kind of democratic arrangements. And many of the developing countries, not only the middle income countries, but especially the poorest countries, they feel they have very, very little voice and very little room for participation. There's also a sense that Europe, for example, is overweighted within the Bretton Woods institutions because of certain criteria which are used for measurement and so on and so forth. So there is a sense of exclusion. So even though the Bretton Woods institutions are inclusive, multilateral institutions, there's a sense that they are not fully, that developing countries in particular are not fully represented. Let me give you an example. In the middle of the 1940s, there were 44 members of the Bretton Woods institutions, and the basic vote for the 44 came to 11.4%. Today there are 184 members. So you would think that the weight of the basic vote would remain the same, and the total weight of these 184 members would be close to 50%, because it is now more than 4 times as much.
And it's not the case.
Well, before the recent reform, it was 2.2%.
Yeah. So, and would you say that precisely this kind of divide existing within the UN system, but also between developed countries and developing countries, is one of the key reasons which make it difficult to really have coordination becoming a reality?
That is certainly one of the problems, but I don't think it's the only problem. There has been for many years now, arguably since the 1960s, a cross-Atlantic mutual suspicion. Okay.
So within the Western world that you have also
Yes,
this.
yes. There's no real unanimity. In Europe, for example, right now, there's a sense that what are called automatic stabilizers are very, very significant, and therefore Europe does not need the kind of big fiscal stimulus which you have seen, for example, in the US and the UK. This is just one debate. In the European Central Bank is very concerned about the problem of inflation. The IMF takes the view that the greatest threat to the world economy today is the threat of deflation, not inflation. These are diametrically opposite views.
But how can you somehow put forward and make it meaningful coordination, having in mind these kind of major differences? In other words, how do you reconcile this point of view? And it's within 3 weeks, so...
In the absence of anything else, it is probably the IMF which should provide the kind of technical leadership in terms of providing the coordination. The United Nations role, in our view, is to look at the bigger picture, to provide the guidelines and the parameters for future reform of the international system, and this is where the role of the UN is. The UN should not be, for example, trying to figure out what the optimal interest rates should be, or optimal exchange rates should be, and so on and so forth. That is a role better left to the IMF. But the IMF currently lacks that kind of credibility and legitimacy precisely because of the governance arrangements.
And because it is felt that it was aligned with the interest of developed and powerful countries and so on.
Right.
And a technical question, why do you think, because once again I'm not an economist, why do you feel that it is up to, that it comes, looking into the technicalities for coordination and so on, have to come from the IMF?
Well, there's no other show in town. Okay, so we have to work with the IMF, and to be fair to the IMF, under the present leadership, for example, I think Mr. Strauss-Kahn has recognized many of the problems which we are talking about. I cited, for example, the IMF recognizes the threat of deflation today, and on many issues, I think the IMF is doing the cutting-edge research and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, on some issues, the IMF is also part of the problem, especially from the perspective of many developing countries.
And do you think that somehow this crisis could be an occasion for the IMF to redeem itself, so to speak, and somehow to provide this technical lead, the UN providing the overall political framework, to have this becoming a serious exercise?
Well, the G20 has certainly given a huge capital infusion to the IMF, which will certainly strengthen the IMF, which before this crisis was in very, very serious trouble. But it would have been better if the G20 had given this capital boost on condition that the IMF itself reform itself. Without reforming itself, the IMF continues to suffer from a legitimacy and credibility problem. That will continue to undermine its ability to provide effective leadership. And part of the problem right now is not just a question of resources, it's a problem of credible leadership. You asked the question earlier, who is leading the charge?
Yes.
And we cannot say that there is anybody leading the charge. because we cannot say the UN is leading the charge. We cannot say the IMF is leading the charge, because the IMF can lead the charge all at once and turns around and there's nobody going with them. The IMF does not even have the full support of the developed countries which dominate the IMF behind it. This is part of the problem right now.
So in a way, we somehow need a kind of a mental revolution to really see things differently and act upon this intellectual case that things have to be changed.
I think we need, if you call it, you can call it mental revolution. We need a sense of ownership that everybody feels that IMF does belong to them,
Yes.
and that IMF is acting in their collective interests, and that is now lacking.
And what are the chances, final question, since we are running out of time, what are the chances for this to happen? The
Well,
sense of ownership.
I think this is where the UN plays an important role, and where the conference in 3 weeks' time can play a crucial role. If the conference can provide a broad framework for the way forward, for leadership, for identifying the crucial reforms which are necessary, it can play a very, very important role, not only in terms of creating conditions much more favorable to reform of the international monetary and financial system, but also indicating the kinds of changes which need to be made if we are going to be able to reflate the world economy. Unfortunately, right now, there is not enough. We are barely 1 year, or arguably 1 or 2 years into the crisis. You know, it took 15 years and a world war before we were able to reform the last time in 1944.
So in essence,
I hope we have learned from history.
Yeah, well, I doubt it, but in essence you are saying that it is not sure that the crisis is deep enough for us to be reasonable moving forward.
Yes, and unfortunately, I'm not sure whether there is enough of a sense of political will or political commitment to do the necessary reforms.
And I would share your view. Mr. Jomo, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Jean-Marc.
Thank you a lot. We have reached the end of this show. I thank you for watching. I am Jean-Marc from the United Nations University Office at the UN here in New York. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Thank you.